Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's stay-at-home lecture series. Glad to have you here tonight. I'm Tim Nutt, Director of the UAMS Historical Research Center, located in the UAMS Library. We are the archives of UAMS, and so we not only collect and preserve the institutional record of UAMS, but also the medical history and the other health sciences history of Arkansas. I'd invite you to come down and visit us sometime. Right now, of course, we're closed because of the pandemic, but I'd love to give you a tour next time we're able to do that. Tonight's the series is sponsored by the Society for the History of Medicine and Health Professions, which is the support organization for the UAMS Historical Research Center. So the Society sponsors programming such as this and also provides some financial support to the Historical Research Center. Each year, the Society has different events going on. Normally about this time we would have our annual dinner that we would be planning for and promoting. Unfortunately, this is another year that we have to cancel because of COVID-19, but we are in the process actually of doing, we will be recording the panel discussion that that was supposed to happen in person at the annual dinner. And so we'll be recording that and then showing it at a later date. And that panel discussion will be talking about the history of the Little Rock Internal Medicine Clinic, which was the first integrated medical clinic in Arkansas that saw both African-American and white patients and had both African-American and white doctors. And so that was founded in 1970, and so we will be celebrating the 50th anniversary of that clinic, and you'll get more information about that in the near future. On your screen is some information about the Historical Research Center, our email address and our phone number. If you'd like to contact us, please feel free to do so. If you have suggestions for presentations. And then there's also information on how to join the society. You can either go to that long URL that's there or go directly to the PayPal account. The dues for the society are fairly inexpensive, $5 if you're a student, not just a student at UAMS, but if you're a student at any Arkansas institution, or for that matter, any out-of-state institution. As long as you're a student, we will accept you at the student rate. And even just an individual rate is inexpensive, $15 for an individual and $25 for a family. So I would encourage you to join if you're not a member. If you are a member, thank you for your continued support. And just a little reminder of some of the upcoming presentations. These lectures happen every first Thursday, the first Thursday of every month, from 7 to 8 p.m. Next month, we are going to have a presentation by Sean Fitzgibbon, and he is an artist, and he has drawn and written a graphic nonfiction work, I should say, about the Crescent Hotel in Norman Baker and his cancer hospital that operated in the Crescent Hotel. So that'll be coming up in October. In November, we'll have Janice Percival from Hot Springs talking about the smallpox epidemic in 1895. And then we'll round out the year with Rachel Patton, the executive director of Preserve Arkansas. And she'll be talking about historic properties that have a health sciences relationship and buildings that are on the National Register of Historic Places. So I hope you'll be able to join us for that. The link that you used tonight to join will get you into all the future stay-at-home presentations. So I hope you can join us in the future for those, just not only for the rest of this year, but through next year. I imagine we'll be continuing these through next year, even after the pandemic is over. Tonight, I'm pleased to welcome Mike Hood to the stay-at-home lecture series. Mike is the civil engineering manager at the city of Little Rock. If you are a member of the Pulaski County Historical Society, you're probably familiar with Mike. He's been He's given numerous presentations to the Historical Society since 2010. He's always a great speaker. He always gives interesting presentations. He always has interesting topics to discuss. And tonight he's going to be talking about the Arkansas Insane Asylum and a little bit about its history, and then also a cemetery, the cemeteries that go along with it. And maybe he might throw in a ghost story in there as well. So I'm going to turn off my camera and audio, and I'm going to stop my screen, and I am going to turn it over to Mike. Mike, it's all yours.
There we go. Good evening, everyone. I guess that you can hear me and see my slideshow here. Is that right?
Yes, we can, Mike.
Okay, here we go. I'm glad you're having me here tonight. I might be a little bit different speaker than what you usually get. I'm not a medical professional by any means. I'm a civil engineer, and I'm the civil engineering manager over at the city of Little Rock. I do a lot of street and drainage work, and I like history and I like maps. I've examined a lot of maps in my career, and I just found some very interesting things along the way. And this is one of them. This topic tonight is something I discovered just accidentally looking at a map. And what you're seeing here is the Arkansas Lunatic Asylum, a photo from about 1887, shortly after it was constructed. The first asylum was authorized by the legislature in about 1873, and they appropriated $50,000 to select and buy a site for the new asylum. And they selected for a site what was then a few miles outside of Little Rock, out in the country, a country setting on top of a little hilltop, a rise with ground sloping around it, and built a very imposing looking facility over the next decades. It took almost 10 years for the facility to actually get constructed and open for business. Uh, Efforts were interrupted by the Brooks-Baxter War. And if you remember, that war kind of put an end to the reconstruction efforts of Arkansas, a definite change in the political regime and priorities. But finally, in about 1881, they were back on track and getting ready to begin construction and appropriate funds for this facility. Governor Augustus Garland remarked in one of his last messages about the asylum, saying that no class of suffering humanity has so large a claim upon the community as this, and no charitable institution is as much needed as one for the proper treatment of these persons. In 1881, they levied a 1 mil property tax statewide, which I think is kind of unusual that there would be a statewide property millage levied, but that millage was to raise money, about $150,000 initially for the construction. And by March 1st, 1883, they had completed construction and were underway. This is an old map. You know what? I don't remember. I think it's the 1905 handy map. And it's a wonderful map if you've ever had a chance to examine it. It shows in great detail all the institutions, the banks, the churches, hospitals, public institutions of every kind, important businesses and manufacturing facilities all over Little Rock and greater Little Rock area. By 1905, Little Rock had just started to develop. Pulaski Heights would have been just starting heavy construction. The streetcar line had been constructed. Here it is. I'm kind of tracing it with my cursor here. The streetcar line that goes up Kavanaugh Boulevard, then called Prospect Avenue. But there was still a lot of empty, undeveloped land all around the territory. I've got in yellow here kind of overlaid where the interstate's built today to give you an idea where things lie, and I've shown in red the main road out from town. The asylum was located on what was called the 7th Street Road, but because of the importance of the asylum, it was soon also known as Asylum Road. And this early map calls part of it out as Asylum Road, as does some later maps. Uh, the remnant of the old Asylum Road and 7th Street Road is Plateau Street. And so some of you that are UAMS folks, I'm sure you know of Plateau Street there, where it intersects Pine and Cedar and the main roads through the area. And that was once called Asylum Road. And then you can see out west here the location of the Insane Asylum. The asylum was so big and such a large important place and such a large employer that they actually extended the streetcar line from 12th Street at Highland Park, that would be around the intersection of 12th, 13th, Pine and Cedar, out to Lewis Street, where it turned and ended at the grounds of the asylum to pick up and drop off visitors and employees. So it was quite a presence for the time. Here's a picture of it in 1910, and you can see how large it has become. In fact, almost from the day it opened, they never quit expanding the facility. It was never large enough. One writer noted, Mr. Dillard, I believe it was, that in the first couple of years, the first 200-bed portion of the facility was filled to capacity, and they had to begin constructing more wings. And they kept constructing and kept constructing and kept constructing. The main part of the building, if you can see my cursor here, is right there in the central part, and that was constructed first. And there's some old photos with doctors, nurses, other interested persons, perhaps board members of that time standing at the entrance of that, and some of you may have seen that photo. What you're seeing here also in the foreground is a little lake. Well, that little lake would be located today about where Pine, Cedar, and 6th Street would be. It would be a view at the bottom of that hill, like you're going up to the interstate highway. It'd be a view from the bottom of that hill. And if you picture that whole area now, which has a lot of parking lots in it now, would have been the little lake area, the little pond area on the grounds looking up towards the asylum. The asylum treated individuals suffering from, of course, all types of mental illness. A partial list of that includes epilepsy, birth defects, learning disabilities, the effects of old age, and many that were admitted there and committed criminal offenses. I'd say, in my own estimation, that in the earliest years, they mixed everybody together, which certainly would not be a good idea. There's obviously a vast difference between some of the different types of mental illnesses that would have been present, and they probably did try to segregate some of those different types of individuals. No doubt the more violent ones were segregated and were confined, but at first they were all mixed up together, black, white, all different types of mental needs. Many of the individuals that put there too were just people that the family couldn't care for. I remember an old editorial writer that occasionally would refer to the crazy aunt in the attic. And, when this facility opened, many of the mentally ill that used to be cared for by family, even though they were perhaps somewhat cloistered away, tucked away from general view, would wind up being committed by the family. The only way that people would be admitted is if family members or other care providers would sign off on it, and it took a judge's order. In the early years, judges were apparently all too willing to get rid of some of the local problems, including some of the problems for the sheriff and local officials. And the leaders of the facilities just decried that there needed to be a procedure to, examine and diagnose these people and verify that they really need to be there. And it's not just a problem that they're trying to push up on somebody else. Some of the other illnesses they treated included dementia, Alzheimer's disease, schizoid and polar disorder, anxiety, delirium, obsessive compulsive behaviors, and even postpartum depression. At first, I thought that was quite remarkable, but it ends up, and you probably all know that can be a very real thing. You just wouldn't imagine that would be an illness that you would be admitted to the insane asylum. There wasn't much of a way in those years to treat them in the early years. Certainly, you'd recognize that medical advances, especially in medicine, were not as far advanced as they are today, but it certainly was common, very common. Sedation was a common strategy towards controlling bad behaviors, and confinement was definitely a part of the whole equation in the treatment process. Um, there were so many people sometimes throughout the life of this facility that one author described patients as just being warehoused in the facility for a lack of space and staff. The conditions were certainly less than desirable at different times. I lately ran across this little booklet. It's quite old, 1902, Jimmy Ward's Experience as a Lunatic. And it was suggested to me by a person that heard this lecture, heard this talk of mine. You've got to read this. You got to read that. And I tell you the truth, I never got through the whole thing, but I did find it very interesting. He fancied himself of wanting to become an entertainer. And this is a picture of him dressed up, ready to be an entertainer, presumably in vaudeville or whatever was popular at the time, theater. Uh, but he definitely was crazy, and it's interesting to read his story because he seems so aware of the fact that he is crazy, he is mentally ill, and that what he's doing is wrong, but yet he does it anyway. He's just, for whatever reason, um, he hated it there. He hated it there a lot, and he felt he was tricked into being there. They were going to give him diagnosis and treatment, and his buddies were all taking over them, and they ended up slam, bang, clang, a double iron door was closed behind me, and soon I saw that I was in the midst of all kinds of crazy people. I don't mean to say that I didn't go crazy, Mr. Ward says, but let's wait and see where I went the craziest, inside the Arkansas Lunatic Asylum or outside of it. And his behavior, by his own admission, was incredibly uh, uncontrolled. His first night there, he wrote that I never did pass such a tough night in the way of sleeping as I did that first night in the asylum. Away down southwest of my room, I could hear a noise that sounded similar to the voices of many thousands of school children on the playground, all hallooing and talking at the same time. It's a hard matter for me to give you a definite idea of just what kind of terrible noises, yells, and shrieks that a person could have heard among the many hundreds of crazy folks confined within those asylum walls at nighttime. It is a terrible thing for one to experience, especially when they're not used to it. His reaction to that was to take with his teeth and chew his mattress to pieces. And when they let him out in the morning, he went on a rampage, kicked and threw everything in sight, kicking spittoons, furniture, anything he'd grab as high as the ceiling. The orderlies chased him, but he was quite active in his own words. And he does look athletic in his picture, and nobody could catch him for a time until finally two of them caught him and held him down. And that started a series. And he never did really calm down. Is all he did was think about how he could escape. He was put in a strong room, and they were like many other small rooms in the asylum, but this one had heavy, heavy bars, and including on the inner window an iron screen. And he writes in his booklet that he almost spent all his time in a strong room out of this time of confinement in the asylum. He also ventured to say he never spent as much as 30 days out of his 180-day confinement without handcuffs or ankle straps on it. So he certainly suffered, but in many ways, I can see why the orderlies were upset with this man. It's interesting. He was obviously educated, and he was a very good writer, uh, but it was just an extreme example, perhaps, of the type of inmates that they dealt with at the time. It has a happy ending, though, of sorts. After his 180 something days of confinement, he wrote a very simple letter to his mother and just says, "If you'll let me out of here, I promise you I will behave, and there will be no more of my former crazy talk or actions. And I just want to leave this place." And the family and the judge agreed that he could go home. And he eventually married and had some notable accomplishment, including the construction. He constructed and flew his own airplane at a time when that would have been a very new and novel thing to do. And I just wondered what come of him. He did marry. This is a later picture of the Arkansas Lunatic Asylum. It's a colored postcard. Um, I wondered when I first run across this picture of a colored postcard of why you would have a why would you send a postcard of the Arkansas Lunatic Asylum, State Hospital for Nervous Diseases? You know, it was renamed several times. Why would you send such a card? And I guess the answer is it's a matter of pride. It was a fine, very large public institution, represented progress, represented solving a problem. Uh, and I guess it was worthy of having its own postcard. And then now this is a little bit politically incorrect, but I also started thinking, what would you write on such a card? What if you were one of the people there and wanted to write, what would you write on your postcard if you're writing home to the family? I would have wrote sooner, but things are a little bit crazy around here. I'd come for a visit, but it's hard to get away. We had some fun laughing about that when we first run across this postcard. And I don't mean to laugh at, I know that's terribly politically correct, but they had postcards. I mentioned earlier how big this facility was, and it was big. By 1913, the State Hospital for Nervous Diseases, it had been renamed, had a main building with 4 male wards to the south, 7 female wards to the north and west, 2 dining halls, a kitchen, a bakery, storerooms, dance hall, 3 building infirmary, a carpenter shop, repair shop, laundry house, ice house, cold storage building, a boiler building, and its own power plant to power the entire facility, a creamery, a carriage house, a scale house, a 100-foot elevated water tower with an 80,000 gallon in-ground water storage reservoir, a hog barn, farm outbuildings, and a cemetery plot. And back then, too, able-bodied inmates, if you will, patients, were required to work. And they worked at those different facilities on those grounds. If they were able to work, they had to work. It was a requirement. Whether it was work in the laundry, work in the kitchen, work in the grounds, whatever was suited to them and their particular condition, they were expected to work. And not only did they operate this facility, there was a very large dairy farm out on Bauckham Pike, which would be the road to Scott. And it was on the banks of the Arkansas River. And unfortunately, the river changed course and took out the old dairy farm, but a portion of it's still there. It's a housing project near Willow Beach. And also in much later years, in about 1936, the Benton farm opened, now known as the Benton Service Center, but it was originally a farm. And in the initial years, up to 2,000 people worked out on the farm to provide food for the asylum. From the accounts I can see, everybody was generally well fed, but there was also accounts that some meal consisted a little more than dried fruit, bread, and water. I don't believe that was the rule, but other writers have said that there was quite good food other than that, but that was occasionally what there was to eat. And I also discovered in later years there was a state hospital annex. And by accident, I run across the purpose of that. The state hospital annex was a hog and poultry farm for able-bodied epileptics. And I thought that a little odd. I can see epileptics otherwise have no particular special needs as far as medical needs or treatment of mental illness. But working on the farm, I guess, was a good fit for them. But oh heavens, if they had a fit and fell down in the hog yard. But that is the fact. That is fact of history. In later years, some of you might remember this picture. Later they removed all the turrets and the Gothic features that made it so imposing, a little bit scary, a little bit Frankensteinish or whatever. They removed those upper portions of the turrets and the mansard roof elements, painted everything white. I guess it looks a little more modern, a little more clean, a little more hospital-like. As I mentioned, in 1905, they changed the name to the Arkansas State Hospital for Nervous Diseases. In 1933, it was changed to the Arkansas State Hospital, and now the State Hospital is a division of Behavioral Health Services of the Arkansas Department of Human Services. Now, oftentimes when patients were admitted here, Many of them stayed for life. It wasn't a short-term thing. Certainly there were some that I guess you could say were cured, or the family had a change of heart, or perhaps the doctors diagnosed were fit to return to society and they were released. Many stayed there the rest of their lives. This was to be their lot. Uh, I'd hope too, as time went on, that there was better medical treatment for them. But the fact is, many of them were wards of the state from then on and remained there for the rest of their lives. And when they would die, there was such a stigma sometimes with the mentally ill. Uh, uh, they may not come forward to claim the body, although many did. Many families did come forward and claim a body when somebody died at the state hospital. Many did not. And it was left to the state to decide what best to do. And at that time, incineration, of course, wasn't in common use at all, I do not believe. And so the option was to bury him in a cemetery. And so they began developing almost from the very first year, burying people on the grounds of the state hospital cemetery. And apparently that wasn't unusual for other state institutions. Not long ago, you might remember over at the deaf school, they found a small plot of graves that were completely forgotten over by the deaf school. And they did discover that there was at least one teacher there buried there, as long with several of the students that were, I guess, wards of the state and needed a place for burial after their death. So, uh, apparently this was not uncommon at all for state facilities to have a cemetery on their grounds. And the cemetery here I've outlined in red, I discovered quite by accident on a 1922 soil map. A map documenting all the different soil stratas and capabilities and classifications, mainly used as for the purposes of building and farming. But those map makers and soil scientists meticulously mapped every single cemetery they ran across, whether it was private or otherwise. And it's been very interesting to kind of look around at those old cemetery sites and see what's left, including an old penitentiary cemetery and just different things I found that I just have always wondered about. Go out there and look and see if you can find anything. Um, Burials continued at this little cemetery I'm showing here in red until the 1930s, when they just about filled up. And in 1938, during the height of the Depression and the height of the Works Progress Administration, a decision was made that they would relocate a lot of these graves. Um, and that was to be done by the CCC. The main cemetery is the large red area here on the edge of the asylum. And then there's another odd little shaped plot over here. From my research, I believe this area, the large area, was for the inmates of the asylum. And this other area here was likely dedicated to burials from UAMS. UAMS had cadaver bodies and parts that would have needed to be disposed of. And although some official sources say UAMS did not have pauper burials, I believe that's incorrect. I believe there is paupers buried in there, was, and it's certainly well documented that paupers from UAMS went out to the paupers field at the city's Oakland Cemetery, which is over on Barber Street, the old Confederate Boulevard. And there's a very large field there that was was designated as a pauper's field for wards of the state and for just unclaimed bodies that were found in Little Rock. Um, and so they made a very concerted effort, the CCC did, to locate and box up and move all the graves that they could document and find on this site, and I think it's mainly this very large area here, and move them out to a new plot. And you might be curious to know where that is today. Well, here you go. Here's where it is today. If you notice, the big red area includes the new entrance. Whoop, not my finger, but use a pointer here. The new entrance here at the state hospital entrance and its parking lot, and the grounds in front of it, a big grassy strip there that people park on sometimes. Over here, you've got the residence hall for UAMS. And over here, you've got the state health department grounds. So let's look at that and think a minute about that. Let's see now. The residences halls. I wonder how many of those students out there might be creeped out to find out that their residence hall is built on top of the first insane asylum cemetery. How about that? Now, that's a little bit of a ghost story in its own way, isn't it, though? I'm going to show you where we go to next. The Reform School for Boys and Girls, and it was known as the State Hospital Annex. This is where the able-bodied epileptics went and spent their time working the hog and poultry farm. And this was at that time far west of Little Rock, described as about 15 miles out when it was first built in 1905. Governor Davis approved an act providing for the establishment of a state reform school for the discipline, education, employment, and reformation of convicts under the age of 18 years of age. It was located a few miles west of Little Rock. Land was purchased, located on the old Perryville Loop Road, and a 3-story building was constructed. It was not a great site. They had a vision that the boys would work on a farm, would work the grounds, participate. They thought work was the answer and was the primary means of reform. But the Gazette reported on August 23rd, 1908, the Reform School is located about 4 miles from the end of the Highland Park car line. That would be the intersection around Pine, Cedar, and 12th. And it consists of about 200 acres of land, which is said to be about as poor variety as can be found anywhere in Arkansas. That such an institution as this was located on such unfertile ground is deplored by nearly everyone who visits the institution. And who can imagine what could be done for such a school for boys upon rich soil? It wasn't long after that they set about to find a new place, and they moved the boys to a farm near Pine Bluff in 1917. And then for just 2 short years, it was taken over as a girls' industrial school. And even that didn't work out, and the girls were moved to a site in Alexander. Finally, it remained vacant for a little while until the state hospital took it over. And here's a map from 1946 of the grounds of the old state hospital annex, the reform school grounds. And it is the main building, the picture I just showed you was located right here, and it had a big looping driveway going around it. This is the old Perryville Loop Road. And you may recognize this road from the next picture because there was a chancellery judge named Edward Rodney Parham who didn't like living in the city. He wanted to go green acres. He wanted to live out on a farm. And so he bought an old farm way out in the countryside and thought that was the life for him. And he eventually acquired some of the old property that was the reform school property. But that road today is Rodney Parham Road, and you can see right over here on the grounds of the old state hospital. I mean, in the old reform school, the state hospital annex is the new state hospital cemetery. And that's what started me on my quest. I ran across this map from 1946 with a state hospital cemetery, and it's like, wow, what is that all about? What is that? And that led me on this long story I'm telling you tonight. And there's a picture of Judge Edward Rodney Parham. The old Perryville Loop was named in his honor after he was instrumental in getting the politicians, if you will, and the funding in place to pave the old Perryville Loop Road. It finally went from gravel to asphalt, a nice 2-lane road out in the country. And in a fit of enthusiasm, they named the road for the old judge in 1953. Many of you know Dr. Richard Clark. Dr. Clark come to me and wanted me to help him, to cooperate with him to find Rodney Parham's old farm, and that's how this story all began. Rodney Parham eventually bought a lot of that old land. This is just a slide that we used at a presentation about Edward Rodney Parham, and here's an outline of the state hospital cemetery. The cemetery was just a little bit creepy. I got to tell you, it was just a little bit creepy. It was way out in the country. all the graves from the old site were relocated out to here by the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. In about 1925, this started to be in use by the state hospital, and it continued on till 1967. And a longtime resident that lived out in this area, grew up out here, is actually one of my neighbors, and she described in a little girl one of the most frightening things that ever happened to her in her whole life growing up out this way. The country was still quite rural, farms everywhere. She was out riding her pony one day, and the old panel truck comes up from the state hospital, drives out there, and she rode her pony off into the trees a little ways and got off and watched what's going on. Well, they opened up the back of the panel truck, and she couldn't see everything going on, but they got something out of the back of the truck, and they got back in the truck and left. So she rode her pony over there to see what there was, and there was a large open grave there with 3 bodies wrapped in sheets. It scared that little girl so bad, she took off running, galloping on her pony all the way home. And she said, I never went back to that cemetery site again. And I can imagine what it was like. But that was kind of the rough treatment that they got sometimes. There just wasn't anybody there and around to give them a ceremony like you might expect, or like what you might think. That was just the last rites, the forgotten dead from the state hospital cemetery. Here's an aerial view of the place from 1960. As you can see here, you can see the regular grid kind of outlining in here, the little roads and alleys and everything that's gone on from the different burials. This little appendage here was along an early road. The road came up from Rodney Parham this way in the early years. It wasn't until later that was cut off as development occurred. But you can clearly see kind of the layout of what everything was here in 1960. And what you're seeing, if you zoom in here, these are actually open graves. And from the accounts I've gotten, that probably a lot of those open graves, now that very well could have been patients from the hospital, but also the different cadaver parts and bodies were brought out here for disposal. And I suspect that's what these larger graves were, some of them as large as 20 by 20 feet by one account. I thought that was very cruel, very unusual that that's how cadavers were treated, until I finally dawned on me. I mean, really, you donate your body to science, and you don't have a name anymore. There's no name associated with that cadaver anymore. It's a number. There's probably a file somewhere that's confidential and protected, maybe even destroyed later, that there's never a name associated with it. It becomes, medical tissue. But if you can imagine throwing all these, I guess, formaldehyde preserved parts into a single grave, it's a little bit creepy when you just really get to thinking about it. But as the years went on, this cemetery was pretty well forgotten. Sorry for the pause there. By the 1960s, they made a decision that they'd no longer use this cemetery. At that time, any dead that needed a proper burial or disposal, if you will, was sent on to the Benton Service Center, where they also have a very large cemetery at that site. So this old site here was turned over from the state hospital to the State Building Services. And the State Building Services had made a decision that they would use that for new state buildings. I thought that was a little bit of an odd decision. But in 1976, Joe Yates, the assistant director of the State Building Services, reported that a contract had been assigned to relocate some of the graves that were on the site, and Griffin, Leggett, Healy, and Roth had been retained for that relocation effort. There was really no plan in place for any kind of large-scale, systematic burial by burial, plot by plot, name by name relocation. Their stated plan was that if a body was uncovered, it'd be moved to the State Hospital Cemetery in Benton. And as far as we know, most of the people out there have no known living relatives, and they are unclaimed bodies. there was some records and locations of where these different burial names and perhaps rows of where they were buried at, but time had marched on. So many years had gone by, and the cemetery, it reported in the newspapers, had been heavily vandalized. Stones had been knocked over, broken off, buried. Pine trees had grown back. Partiers had been out there and left litter and trash everywhere. It had become overgrown and unsightly, and there wasn't much out there. Um, and the rules back in the 60s, in about what, 67, well, 76 actually, uh, we're not like what they are. We didn't have all the environmental rules. We didn't even have the state laws on the books about how disinterring a body is to occur, and it even takes a court order in these days. That those rules didn't exist, and they just went out there and started work. Now, one thing I might go back and remark on, and it's a little odd, is when they first relocated a lot of the bodies out here, they were relocated in a small section, either right up here in this corner or out where this little triangular appendage is, trapezoidal appendage. And those were very small boxes. When they relocated from the old cemetery in 1938, there was nothing left but bones. And they just put those in small little boxes in small little grave sites that were perhaps 2 by 4 feet. And I ran across somebody at one of these lectures I did, one of these little talks, that said, well, didn't they used to bury all those people standing up because the graves are so small? It's like, no, that's not what happened. They weren't buried standing up. They were put in very small bone boxes. You see, often I've talked to several cemetery sextons that are in the business, and these older graves with an unembalmed body, they don't last a long time. That's just the facts of the matter. We're a wet climate, lots of rain, wet soils. Soils are slightly acidic. There is all you find left in the end, or maybe if that, some large bones, and maybe some coffin hardware and different things. Sometimes nothing at all but a stained soil is all that's left after some years have gone by. But that wasn't the case in the relocation, the state building efforts that went on. I was actually very well acquainted with a fellow that was on site during the initial excavation, and he said it was just something I just wished I'd never seen. I wished I'd never been around. I wished I could forget it. For him anyway, it was pretty horrendous. He was assisting with uncovering the graves of the old part of the cemetery over where the UAMS had its cadaver cemeteries, and they would just go through and lay out their footings and start digging for new buildings, and they did uncover bones and they did uncover hardware. And I guess they were kind to the extent that the state inspectors were there full time, and the construction would stop and they'd gather up the burial remains and they would box it up and store it in a secure location for transport to the Benton Service Center, where it was reinterred in mass graves. So people have written online and even asked me, well, how would I ever know where my relative is now? Well, you're not going to know. If you want to look to remember them, you can look to them at the monument that was left behind or down at the Benton Service Center. And that's just really all that you've got right now. It was estimated by state building services that there was about 3,000 to 4,000 graves on the site when they started. I think that number was extremely low, or at least underestimated by about 50%. This is an interesting enough story that I enlisted some map makers that are very knowledgeable in GIS techniques, and they estimate, yeah, maybe 3,000 to 4,000, but also by some estimates 5,000 to 6,000 graves. I've been to the state archives and tried to see. There is some records and names, but even those records appear to be very, very incomplete. I think whatever records there may have been in possession of building services, nobody seems to know exactly where they are now. What records exist are over at the Benton Service Center. They estimate when they were done, they left behind about 1,500 to 2,000 graves. So there's still about 2,000 graves on the site today. Halloween's coming, everybody. I actually kind of enjoy Halloween just because it's fall. But I always ask people, do you believe in the spirit world? Do you think that there's a spirit world out there? You know, the Christians do. The Christians believe it a lot. You know, then there's several examples in the Bible and elsewhere dealing with the questions of the afterlife. You know, one of my most famous ones probably is where King Saul seeks out the prophet Samuel and enlists a medium to conjure him from the grave. And Samuel appears in flowing white robes and a long beard and says, "Why have you woken me from my slumber?" And in other stories, there's the story of a rich man who's doomed to purgatory, I guess to the other side rather, of a man doomed to Hades who cries out to Lazarus and Abram to relieve his suffering and his torment and give him just dip his finger in water and give him a drink. And Abraham says there's a great gulf that's been set between heaven and hell that cannot be crossed, over. You've made your decision just as Lazarus has made his. And in the realm of folklore and superstition, we have All Hallows Eve, the day before All Saints Day. And it's on All Hallows Eve when the spirit world is said to be especially active. And then in ancient traditions, we're setting out jack-o'-lanterns and other talisman to scare off the evil spirits from around us and our world. If you Google the State Hospital Cemetery, you will find that there are groups of people that have done spiritual investigation, I guess, the realm of ghosts, set out there all night, ghost hunters in search of spectral energy. And those folks say there's a lot of spectral energy and made contact with many spirits out here. It's said when you disturb their grave, they're doomed to walk the earth forever. Well, whether or not you believe all that, I think it's kind of interesting how the story ends. You might say, where is that old cemetery? Where is the last of that old cemetery we've been looking at? Well, a big chunk of it is at the Arkansas State Crime Laboratory. And all you medical types are going to know exactly what's going on there. That's the largest morgue and autopsy lab in the entire state of Arkansas. All the autopsies performed in criminal and prosecutorial investigations occur right here. This is where it all goes on. And so that is the end of my real life ghost story. The state crime lab sits on top of the old Insane Asylum cemetery. And out there on those grounds, there's still 2,000 old graves from the Insane Asylum all over that site. And that's the rest of the story.
Thank you, Mike. That was very interesting. We had if you don't mind stopping your video, and that way it'll make your screen bigger. And
all right, did that do what we needed to do?
Let me see. I'm trying to get where my video comes up too.
Do I need to hit stop sharing? Did I
stop
share? There we go.
Yeah,
there we go.
There it is. Okay. And let me do that. Well, that's not going to work. We'll do it this way. That'll work. We have a couple of questions, I think. Let's see. Let's do, we have a couple of questions, Mike. Have a couple of people saying great presentation, really enjoyed it. Where would the names of the doctors who worked at the asylum from 1903 to 1920 be located?
I don't know that I've run across that or even tried to completely research that. One of the best articles I run across, though, was actually in the records of the Pulaski County Historical Society. They keep a meticulous record of their journals throughout the years back to 1951, and one of those records I did rely on was a very lengthy article from the Pulaski Historical Society Journal. I've got it. If you really want to read it, I'll go either look for the scan or go scan the paper copy I made at the library, and you're welcome to read it. It's quite in depth.
And there are annual reports from the insane asylum, so I would think maybe the doctors might be listed in the annual reports for them, or do the annual reports go back that far?
I'm not certain. Maybe somebody listening in is.
If anyone has any answers to that, use the chat feature to put your answer down or a question, if you're interested in making a question or asking a question or making a comment. But I know there was an article in the paper not too long ago about, maybe a couple weeks ago, from 1935, the annual report from 1935 about the state hospital and the conditions, I guess, at the state hospital in the 30s.
Okay. Now, I do remember running across mention of those old annual reports, and it was I believe the first name is Virginia and the last name's Goff, Goff, I believe. She was at the state capitol at their archives, and she is the one that had done an excellent amount of research of what she could find out about these old cemeteries and also some of the history of the asylum itself. And she had written several pages of very good information that relied on those annual reports. I've got that material too. I saved everything I found on it.
Um, well, it's certainly an interesting topic, and it's really sad that there's still, what'd you say, about 2,000, 3,000 graves still.
I think the upper limit is 2,000 graves, by the state's own estimate. And where those are going to be located is there's some unused ground around that big monument. And that monument is located on the western edge of Natural Resource Drive and in a grove of trees. And I believe that would have been one of the last, or among one of the last sections they actually used for burials. And otherwise, under the parking lots, in the trees, and especially all along the north boundary of that site, north of Natural Resource Drive, is still all wooded and grassy areas, and that undoubtedly is still has all the original graves undisturbed.
Mm-hmm. So if anyone has any questions, again, you can use the chat feature to ask questions. But it's so interesting that you got into this just sort of serendipitous, because Dr. Clark was doing research on Rodney Parham, and this just sort of came about, and it led to your research into this.
And I think I'm proud of myself. Even the researchers I talked to could not find where the original old cemetery was on at the old grounds. And like I said, I found that accidentally in a 1920s soil map, and nobody was ever able to figure out exactly where there was. There was a lot of chatter written online, but nobody knew anything about it.
Mm-hmm. We have another question. Mary Evans says, we went out there several times in the early 1970s. There were a lot of markers with just numbers on them. What were those?
Those undoubtedly corresponded to the early burial book. And some of that book or some of those records apparently still exist out at the Benton Service Center, but I have not gone to look. Miss Goff over at the State Archives had gone to look at that, or had inquired of it, and had transcribed by hand a number of names, pages of names from those early burials, but probably the numbers would have corresponded to a name in a book.
Mm-hmm. I know you mentioned Jimmy Ward earlier in the talk, and I know he's buried at Oakland Cemetery.
Yes, Oakland had a number of burials there, I believe, from the hospital, and especially in the years after the first cemetery ran out of room, they went out to Oakland, which had a number of burials there, as well as receiving burials from UAMS.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another interesting story in itself. The old Pauper's Field, or most of what was called the Pauper's Field for those types of indigent burials, is now 6 feet under part of the National Cemetery. They just went over the old field, added 6 foot of dirt, and continued burying the veterans in it.
Mary made a comment in as a follow-up to her question about the numbers, she said they were told that they were embarrassed to have names on them. I don't think that's probably true, but I think that's probably just maybe just as the numbers, as you mentioned, just as cross-reference to the burial book.
I don't know.
I mean, it could be true, I guess.
Yeah.
But,
I think, you know, not a lot of time and effort was spent on it.
mhm.
Certainly there's eyewitness accounts that they weren't even provided coffins in some instances. Now, I don't know though if that was cadaver burial or if that was actually, you know, people from the state hospital.
Mhm.
I'm not certain. I believe though a lot of the early ones did have wooden coffins.
Mhm. We don't, you know, aside from the burials, we don't really know how many people over time were actually in the asylum, the different names of the asylum, all, you know, from the lunatic asylum all the way up to the, you know, probably the state hospital in the 1930s or 1960s. We don't really have a true account of how many people were admitted to the hospitals, do we?
Oh, I don't think so. No. No, and we don't have a true account of how many might have been buried. It's just some of the records appear to have been lost. I believe Ms. Goff mentioned in her notes that some records may have been lost by water damage at the hospital.
Mhm. Well, and that's probably the case, I would imagine, or probably neglect from the looking after the records as well. And I can scan the article that you mentioned that's in the Pulaski County Historical Review, and I can send that out to the folks who attended tonight. But I've read that article. It's a very interesting article.
All right. And I'll be glad to share any of the other stuff I got if you'd like me to. It's probably too large to email, but I could put it in some media we can transfer it to you.
Yeah, if anyone's interested in any more of the materials that Mike has, you can just contact me, or Mike, I guess they could just contact you directly at the
Hey, you're welcome to do it.
And so I'll send out your email to the
Okay.
folks via my email, and then they can just get in touch with you directly. And I'll note that your presentation tonight is being recorded, and it'll be made available on YouTube probably within a couple of weeks. So if you'd like to watch it again, or you can forward it to your friends and some other people who might be interested in watching it. So it doesn't look like we have any more questions, Mike. So if you don't have anything else to share with us, and I appreciate you being here. Thank you for an interesting presentation, and we'll say good night then.
Good night, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Mike. Everyone be safe.